A former insane asylum whose ghosts have killed, an overgrown lake lodge where ghouls and terrifying monsters lurk, and a Confederate cemetery where the dead just can't seem to rest await on this journey through some more of Ohio's most haunted places. Let's jump right in. Hey guys, and thanks for joining me for another journey through the heartland of Ohio as we explore some of the region's most haunted places. Recognized for its awe-inspiring historic points of interest, jaw-dropping forests, beautiful cities, unparalleled food, and more, the Buckeye State is also infamous for its chilling old hill folklore, classic ghost stories, and tales of terrifying monsters. Are you sure you're ready for this one? Our first haunt lands us in southeastern Ohio and has us exploring the infamous Athens Lunatic Asylum. The Athens Lunatic Asylum, which is located where else but in Athens, Ohio, is a former historic mental hospital that's become massively popular amongst dark tourists and paranormal investigators since its abandonment, and that's bounds are rumored to harbor the tortured spirits of the many patients who passed on within its walls. Historically, through the early to mid-19th century, lands now holding the Athens Lunatic Asylum were originally the site of the Arthur Coates and Eliakim H. Moore farms. However, through the 1860s, both of said farms were acquired for the purpose of the construction of an asylum to house and treat the region's mentally ill. And in 1868, the facility we know today was designed under architect Levi T. Schofield in the now infamous Kirkbride Plan. Subsequently, the asylum would open its doors in 1874. Through its years of operation, it would put its patients to on-grounds work as a form of therapy. Additionally, it would utilize brutal methods of treatment including sensory deprivation, water therapies, electroshock, drug-induced comas, and the ever-infamous lobotomy procedure. By the 1950s, the asylum would act as Athens' largest employer, with over 1,800 patients and hundreds of staff members stretched over 1,000 acres and 78 buildings. But this era of prosperity would quickly wane. Also through the 50s, public views towards the mentally ill would change as many realized firstly that they didn't pose a threat to communities as previously believed, and secondly, that therapy methods up to this point, which pretty much verged on torture, were only making the situation worse and not better. Following advancements in said field and in psychoactive drugs enabling patients to live normal lives outside of what was basically a prison-like setting, patient numbers would dwindle. The asylum's final blow would land in 1993 with the construction of a modern facility across town, after which, the same year, this old, outdated campus would close its doors for good. Later the same year, property rights for the asylum would be acquired by Ohio University, and through the 2000s, it would grow into a popular destination for urban explorers and paranormal investigators. In the present, the old asylum is recognized as the Ridges and hosts a number of events with touring options regularly available. Like a classic haunted hospital out of any Hollywood movie, the Athens Lunatic Asylum is rumored to harbor its fair share of ghosts tied to its torturous past, and those who have braved its bounds have reported doors opening and closing on their own, phantom footsteps that emanate through empty halls, and instances of electronic devices such as cell phones, cameras, and tablets behaving erratically or dying on full charges. Easily the most famous story tied to this weathered old facility has to do with a former patient, one Margaret Schilling. On December 1st of 1978, it was noticed that Schilling had gone missing, and after a thorough search turned up nil, it was generally believed that she somehow escaped and was on the run elsewhere. Sadly, over a month later, in January of '79, employees stumbled across the body of poor Margaret in an old, long-abandoned ward, and an autopsy would reveal her cause of death to be heart failure. Disturbingly, her body left a human-shaped stain on the ground where she fell, and to this day, all attempts to remove this imprint have been met in failure. One popular theory is that Margaret found her way into the ward and was tormented by its ghostly residents, resulting in her heart giving out. And into the present, her apparition has been sighted staring from the window of the room she was found in, as well as drifting eerily amongst the halls. Additionally, the spirits of other patients as well as medical staff have been sighted through the hallways of the asylum. And more disturbing, it's told the ghosts of patients who've misbehaved and who were chained down in the basement might still linger, with multiple accounts of clinking heard through its depths. Lastly, the old site totes several burying grounds, and across them, a handful of accounts detail shadowy figures that hide behind headstones and trees, as well as one particular spot where tombstones are placed in a circle that's rumored to be where witches once met. And on to number 2, which takes us to southwestern Ohio and has us checking in at the Golden Lamb. The Golden Lamb, which is located in Lebanon, Ohio, is a historic restaurant, bar, and inn that's grown wildly in popularity amongst both locals and travelers, as well as an infamy due to its purported range of supernatural activity. Historically, the structure now hosting the Golden Lamb was constructed in 1803 as a stagecoach shop and railroad hotel when entrepreneur Jonas Seaman purchased a license to keep a house of public entertainment for just $4 in the then freshly established village of Lebanon. Incidentally, this house would earn its moniker from a sign that was set out front, depicting a golden lamb with no words, as a majority of the public at the time couldn't read. Subsequently, the lamb would serve the community and its travelers for the next century, and would eventually undergo a name change to what was called the Lebanon House. And while it was profitable enough to stay afloat through the early 1900s, many longtime locals felt that the establishment had strayed from its original image, and that's when one Bob Jones stepped in. Through the late 1920s, Jones would purchase the property with the goal of restoring both the old inn itself and also its historic name, all the while establishing a restaurant with a menu strong enough to pull in consistent business. Through hard work and dedication, Jones accomplished these goals, and he slowly transformed the old stage stop into what has since earned numerous accolades. More recently, the Cleveland scene would declare the Lamb an essential Ohio destination restaurant, and Food and Wine would title it as one of the best classic restaurants in Ohio. In the present, the Lamb remains open to the public and offers unparalleled dishes, drinks, and fine accommodations. While it's not really known how many spirits haunt the premises of the Golden Lamb, both visitors and staff members to its bounds suspect it might be a good number. And those who've braved its bounds have reported lights that turn on and off by themselves, commotions or voices heard from empty rooms, and shadowy figures spied either watching the living from darkened spaces or rounding corners quickly. One more prominent local ghost story tells the tale of Civil War-era Ohio Congressman Clement L. Vallandigham, who was a leader of the Northern anti-war effort and who, facing charges of treason, fled to Canada, where he launched a campaign while in exile to return to the States as an Ohio governor. Years later, when he earned safe passage back to the States, Clement stayed at the Golden Lamb while representing and preparing a defense for one Thomas McGeehan, who was accused of fatally shooting a Tom Myers in a saloon brawl. Darkly ironic as it is, when Vallandigham drew his weapon to demonstrate how it was possible that the victim could have shot himself, he accidentally pulled the trigger and fired a bullet into his abdomen, after which he would expire in his second-floor room the next day. Incidentally, the ghost of Clement has been sighted wandering about in old-fashioned attire, sometimes sporting a bloody bullet hole through his gut. Another apparition cited throughout the Lamb is that of Ohio Supreme Court Justice Charles R. Sherman, who, in 1929, passed suddenly and unexpectedly at the inn at only 41 years of age, leaving his wife and 11 children, including future Civil War General William T. Sherman, behind and penniless. Sadly, most of his children were later put up for adoption, and the ghost of Charles has been sighted meandering about with a sad look on his face. Lastly, the most famous ghost at the Golden Lamb is that of a little girl, who was initially believed to be the spirit of one Sarah Stubbs, who actually lived at the inn as a child. Strangely, however, careful research has since proven that Sarah didn't actually die at the inn and lived well into her 70s. And in more recent times, a new theory claims that this small spirit actually belongs to an Eliza Clay, daughter of the famous Henry Clay, who fell ill while traveling with her family to DC, resulting in them staying the night at the inn, where she eventually passed. Whatever the case, this young lady has been sighted all over Golden Lamb grounds and has been known to seemingly attempt communication with visitors, giggle from darkened rooms, and tug on people's shirts before vanishing into nothingness. Number 3 takes us to northern Ohio and on a walk through the historic Malabar Farm. Malabar Farm, or now the Malabar Farm State Park, which is placed within Richland County in Ohio, is a historic farm expanse and the former home of Pulitzer Prize-winning author Louis Bromfield, that's bounds have long been shrouded in a number of local legends and tales of strong paranormal activity. Historically, Bromfield, who was born in Mansfield, Ohio, in 1896, would grow up working on his grandfather's farm, a lifestyle that he grew to love and cherish, and later, in 1914, he would enroll at Cornell Cornell to study agriculture. Sadly, however, his family's finances would wane, resulting in him dropping out of school after only one semester, after which his parents would sell their property and move to the aforementioned family farm from 1915 to 1916, which was on the outskirts of town. Unfortunately, the farm would fail to pull the profits necessary to sustain their well-being, and following another brief semester in school, this time at Columbia, Lewis would volunteer himself later the same year to the Army to assist in World War I efforts. Following the war, Bromfield would find work as a journalist, critic, and publicity manager in New York City, where he would meet and marry socialite Mary Appleton Wood. Subsequently, the couple would welcome 3 daughters into the world, and in 1924, the writer would publish his first novel, The Green Bay Tree, which, unlike much literature of its era, would feature a strong, independent female protagonist. A year later, his second novel, being Possession, was published to overwhelmingly positive reception. Over the years, Lewis and his family would move to Paris, and later, to Hollywood, where he would work as a screenwriter. All the while, the author would take trips to India, amongst other places, and through his travels, he would learn various agricultural techniques used in a slew of gardens, parks, farms, and more. Finally, in 1939, and following the 1937 release of quite possibly his most critically acclaimed book, being The Rains Came, Lewis would purchase a farm in Richland County, which he would call Malabar, stating that considering what important grow techniques he'd learned in India, nothing was more fitting than an Indian name. Following the purchase of a total of 595 acres on the site, Bromfield would go on to construct a 19-room Greek Revival-style home dubbed the Big House, which he would eventually expand and modernize a number of times, alongside a slew of outbuildings and farm facilities. And over the years, he would purchase more acreage, totaling around 1,000 acres when said and done. Sadly, following the death of his wife Mary in 1952, and while Lewis would continue to date for a time and even plan a new marriage, it's said that everyone close could tell a piece of himself was missing, and that his health would deteriorate, eventually resulting in his death in 1956, after which his family would donate the farm to a conservation foundation. In 1972, the deed for Malabar Farm was acquired by the state. In 1973, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places, and in 1976, the expanse was officiated as a state park. The Malabar Farm State Park remains open into the present, offering a number of trails, tours, events, and more. But beautiful scenery isn't the only thing offered on the farm, and both staff and guests over the years have reported a range of supernatural happenings across its grounds, including doors that open and close on their own, extreme cold spots felt through the heat of summer, and disembodied voices and laughter heard from empty buildings. Easily the most famous story surrounding the farm has to do with one Seeley Rose. As it's told, in 1873, couple David and Rebecca Rose would give birth to a baby girl that they'd call Celia, or Seeley as a nickname. As Seeley grew, it was written by people of the time that they considered her unattractive and somewhat mentally slow. Through the summer of 1896, Seeley would meet neighbor Guy Berry, who was around her age, and who, thinking her a nice person, treated her with kindness. Sadly, she mistook his kindness for true love and began telling everyone that they were to be married, to which, to avoid breaking her heart, Guy told her that his parents forbade said marriage. After receiving this news, it said that Seeley flew into a rage and began exacting her revenge on everyone around her by way of poisoning their foods with arsenic. When all was said and done, she would kill her father, her 31-year-old brother, and eventually her own mother, before admitting to her crimes, being sentenced to life in an asylum, and dying in Lima in 1934. Since this day, many have reported encounters with the apparitions of her parents and brother all throughout the area, who are usually covered in warts, skin discoloration, and lesions, all typical signs of arsenic exposure. And the ghost of Seeley herself has been known to manifest shrieking in rage, and has even chased several through the woods and from the area. Also reported across the farm, and usually through the Big House, are instances of objects sighted moving on their own, figures spied through windows of rooms that are supposed to be empty, and old-timey music heard without source. And through the surrounding forests, many have told of the sightings of strange hominid creatures that stalk the brush, of phantom fires sighted in the distance that disappear when approached, and instances of those few who have been exploring after sundown and dared to whistle into the night, only to be met with a chilling whistle back from the darkness. Number 4 lands us just east of Cleveland and has us braving the iconic Punderson Manor Lodge. Punderson Manor Lodge, along with the whole of Punderson State Park, which is placed out of Newberry, Ohio, is a historic construct held on a sprawling 741-acre expanse, complete with a lake, trails, and more. That's bounds are infinitely popular amongst nature enthusiasts, hikers, hunters, campers, boaters, and anglers, and that's long been surrounded by tales of supernatural encounters. Historically, Punderson Lake, which spans 90 acres and is around 90 feet deep, has a past dating back to the Ice Age and is recognized as one of the deepest glacial lakes in the region. In more recent history, the area surrounding the lake was inhabited by tribes native to the landscape, including by the Erie and the Iroquois, who would thrive using the shore's plentiful fishing and hunting opportunities, and of course, its fresh waters. Later still, in 1795, General Moses Cleveland and a group of surveyors would chart the area and would dub it the Western Reserve, after which, in 1806, one Lemuel Punderson would travel from New Haven, Connecticut, and would discover what he'd call the Big Pond. Punderson would go on to settle what is now Newberry, and he would build a worker's cabin next to the Big Pond, alongside a grist mill and distillery. Eventually, Lemuel and his wife, Sybil, who would welcome a total of 6 children into the world, would move into the worker's cabin, and following Lemuel's death in 1822, his family would continue to work and develop the area, and would eventually rename the Big Pond as Punderson Pond in his honor. Subsequently, Sybil would pass on in 1872, and as the pond belonged to the Punderson estate, it would eventually be open to the public for recreational use. In 1885, one James E. Wales would construct what he called the Wales Hotel near the lake, which would remain in operation for the next 2 decades. In 1902, W.B. Cleveland, who was actually the descendant of the aforementioned Moses Cleveland, would start purchasing land around the lake under the vision of transforming the Wales Hotel into a private hunting and fishing estate, and would construct what he called the Big House in 1904. And through the 1920s, one Dr. E. Coppage would purchase Cleveland's lands and would contract the property to Carl Long, who tore down the Big House and built an English-style Tudor mansion in its wake. After only a short time, the estates of Coppage and Cleveland would reclaim the property. Through the early 1930s, it would be utilized as a girls' summer camp, and after a steady financial decline over the next 2 decades, in 1948, it would be acquired by the state of Ohio. In 1951, the state would begin extensive repairs and renovations to the old mansion. In 1956, the property was opened to the public as a lodge featuring 8 rooms and dining facilities. And in 1965, a $1.4 million renovation would add an additional 24 rooms and 26 cottages. A year later, in 1966, the Punderson State Park Lodge was opened, featuring its aforementioned accommodations, along with tennis courts, an outdoor pool, shuffleboard, a snack bar, and dining room that could hold up to 160 guests, meeting facilities, a golf course, marina, beach, and of course, hiking trails leading every which way across the massive landscape. From this day forward, the Manor Lodge has become a cherished and iconic landmark in its local community, and in 2016, it was added to the Historic Hotels of America. The lodge and park remain open to this day and offer unparalleled accommodations and a slew of activities tied to the lake and its surrounding forests. The first and most famous local legend surrounding Punderson's park grounds involves Lemuel Punderson himself and is somewhat comical in nature. As it's told, one day, Lemuel set sail into the middle of the lake in a bathtub, and when he was right in the center, pulled the plug, sinking himself, and drowning in the depths of what was probably his favorite place. To this day, it's said that during full moons, or on particularly foggy nights, one can see old Lemmy in his bathtub, paddling out into the middle of the pond, before slowly sinking beneath the waves and out of sight. Within the lodge itself, both staff and guests have reported doors opening and closing on their own, extreme cold spots felt in temperature-controlled rooms, instances of objects sighted moving or even floating, disembodied laughter heard near the circular staircase, and figures seen out of the peripheral that are always gone when witnesses go to take a second look. One more popular story tells that in 1885, several children died in a fire that destroyed the former Wales Hotel, which is right across the lake from our current lodge. Disturbingly, their small voices have been heard over the pond, as well as around the lodge itself, and several groundskeepers have reported finding small boot prints in fresh mud when the property is void of any children. A more prominent apparition that's been cited multiple times around the lodge is one resembling none other than W.B. Cleveland himself. Incidentally, the form of Cleveland has been spied watching over the lobby, ascending and descending the stairs, and hurrying down various hallways. And when his grandson was informed of the potential that his grandfather's ghost might still linger in the lodge, he was quoted saying that he felt his entity might be hanging around out of an undying love and sense of duty to the place, and that he most likely wanted to be buried there. Another Punderson Lodge story tells that the aforementioned Carl Long, who lost his fortune before losing the lodge in 1929, might have killed himself in the hotel's attic. While there are no death records to support this tale, over the years, a slew of unconnected employees have reported observing the form of a man resembling Carl hanging by the neck in the attic, that always vanishes shortly after being spotted. Also reported throughout the lodge are instances of faucets within locked rooms found turned to full blast, loud noises that emanate from unoccupied rooms, and ghostly laughter that's often accompanied by cold blasts of air when there are no open windows nearby. Lastly, through the whole of the park grounds and across its many trails, hikers have reported ghost lights that flit amongst the trees, instances of surrounding forests seemingly changing in an attempt to keep them there, and encounters with a range of cryptids from Ohioan lore, including Sasquatch, Melonheads, Pukwudgies, and the dreaded Dogmen. Saving the best for last, our fifth and final haunt takes us to the heart of Ohio, to Columbus's Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery. The Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery, which is located out of Columbus, Ohio, is a historic burying ground placed atop what was once a military staging and training camp that's bounds welcome countless visitors each year, and that's surrounded by a slew of chilling ghost stories tied to those laid to rest within. Historically, following the bombing of Fort Sumter in April of 1861, thousands of men from around the region would begin journeys to Columbus, Ohio, to enlist as volunteers in the Union Army, after which Camp Jackson was established just north of the downtown area. Eventually, it was decided that any recruiting camp should be outside of city limits, and through May of the same year, Camp Chase was established on a flat tract of land known as the Race Grounds. Notably, it would derive the moniker Chase after Salmon P. Chase, who was a former Ohio governor and the Secretary of the Treasury under none other than Abraham Lincoln. Initially, Camp Chase would act as a volunteer training grounds, and through the war, would see a total of around 150,000 Union troops pass through its gates. Additionally, over the months following its creation, it was realized that the area's lack of cover made it perfect for a lockup to hold prisoners of war, and that they had nothing to hide behind should they choose to attempt to escape. And the camp would welcome the construction of its first prison, which was designed to hold around 250 prisoners. Over the course of the war, this prison was enlarged several times, and at its height would hold over 9,000 Confederate prisoners, who were policed by 650 Union guards, all of which was contained within 12-foot high wooden walls. By war's end, the prison would see a total of 25,000 inmates pass through its gates. However, many of its prisoners, being secessionist politicians or socialites, were only held for a short time as per the rules of warfare, and would be released either days or weeks later as political prisoners. While many of the POW camps we've covered in the past toted brutal or downright torturous conditions, a lot of the Confederate prisoners held at Camp Chase were eventually allowed to walk the streets of Columbus while maintaining their firearms, and most being literate were even permitted to sit in on state legislature sessions. And this more gentle method of policing would continue through the end of the war when it was disestablished. Beginning in the 1870s, former campgrounds would be divided up and sold off to various interested parties, and subsequently, these tracts would be redeveloped for different purposes, most of which that included residential and commercial interests. Also through the late 1800s, one William H. Knoss would travel to North Carolina and Virginia on business and would form a strong bond with an ex-Confederate that would act as his guide. Knoss would arrive to Columbus in 1893, and when he learned of the former camp's still standing Confederate cemetery, which at the time had become overgrown and was infested with wild animals, he would rally a group to clean it up and spread flowers across the old yard. In 1895, Knoss would plan a small memorial which would eventually be held in 1896 and again in 1897. By 1902, the yard's annual memorial service was turned over to the Daughters of the Confederacy, and over the years, this service has grown into a strong local tradition. Much more recently, 1995 would mark the 100th anniversary of the Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery's annual memorial celebration. On a side note, the markers that are now held within the old burying grounds were actually added shortly after the turn of the 20th century, and as it was made illegal to disinter buried dead, there's actually no way of knowing whether bodies lie below them or not. In the present, this aged yard remains open to the public, welcoming countless visitors each year, and continues to hold its annual memorial celebration. Not really all that surprisingly, this aged old burying grounds is rumored to harbor the spirits of those who died while in captivity, most of whom succumbed to serious injuries before they were captured. And all across cemetery grounds, visitors and officials have reported extreme cold patches felt in adverse weather, strange fogs that descend upon the yard alone and on otherwise clear nights, and the phantom sounds of chatter, laughter, and music that many believe are echoes from late nights when POWs had nothing better to do than pass time with good stories, jokes, and songs that reminded them of home. One of the cemetery's most high-profile apparitions is that of its iconic and legendary woman in gray. While her identity in life is unknown, countless are tales of those passing by or exploring the cemetery when they run into a beautiful lady in a gray Civil War-era traveling suit. Notably, all encounters detail this woman walking slowly with her head bowed, and she's been known to leave flowers on various graves before fading away into nothingness. Several informal investigations of the yard have yielded high EMF levels, crystal clear EVPs, entailing what are believed to be conversations held over a century ago, orbs in photography and video, and hits on both spirit boxes and Ouija boards, while others have claimed to feel hands on their shoulders, playful arm punches, and taps on the back when no one else is around. Another of this weathered old burying ground's more prominent apparitions is that of an unknown young woman who walks amongst the headstones, around nearby trees, and straight through the iron gates which are securely locked after dark. For years, many saw this apparition and believed her to be the woman in gray. However, multiple accounts detail different facial features and clothing that is in fact not gray. This young lady has also been sighted standing over and staring at the grave of the unknown soldier, as well as by another marker belonging to Benjamin F. Allen, a member of the 50th Tennessee Infantry Regiment, Company D. While there is very little known of the spirit's origins, much like the woman in gray, she's been known to leave flowers on these two graves in particular, and some believe she may be the ghost of the widow of one of its many soldiers, possibly of Allen's, forever mourning her loss in the afterlife. Lastly, other phenomena experienced in the yard include instances of personal electronics going haywire, strange blurs and silhouettes captured in pictures taken around the site, and the smells of cooking food and tobacco smoke without source. And several have told of their vehicles stalling out near, leaving them waiting for help right in front of its ominous gates. Thanks for joining me on this adventure through some more of Ohio's most haunted places. If you enjoyed hearing my histories and ghost stories, subscribe to my channel, throw this upload a like, and share me with anyone you feel could use a good scare. I'll catch you all next time, and stay spooky.